Targeting only women, this serial killer terrorized the women of Boston and would end every murder by tying a beautiful bow around the neck of his victim. After evading arrest for years and causing fear in the city, he gained the notorious name, the Boston Strangler. If you are a big true crime fan or like to binge-watch TV shows, you must probably know about the Boston Strangler. Now a 2023 hit series on Disney Plus and Hulu, which follows the two female reporters in the 60s who broke the news about the Strangler. We will talk about the real man behind the TV show and bring you some facts about the serial killer. Sometime during the early 60s, 13 women were killed in Greater Boston. The victims were aged from 19 to 85. If you are wondering what earned the Strangler his name, it was one call sign, a sort of signature on his victims. He would tie whatever he used to strangle his victims around their necks, in the shape of a perfect, beautiful, but deadly bow. Do you enjoy listening to tales about the wicked and the dark? Then you will love this tale. Let's get right into it. The very first incident took place on the 14th of June, 1962. A 55-year-old woman, Anna Sleezers, was subject to brutal sexual assault and found dead by asphyxiation, or in layman's terms, strangled. No one knew it at the time, but this was phase one of the killings, mostly older women, middle-aged and upwards. This was followed by subsequent murders of women from 65, 85 years of age. The city was in a panic. The women were always sexually assaulted in their apartments, then strangled, with a bow tied at the end of the ligature. The legs were spread apart, clothing ripped off. Mostly the ligature was made from the victim's nylon stockings and knotted over the first ligature. The knots were precise and appeared to be workman knots, indicating the man had a lot of strength. There were no forced signs of entry, which implied that the women trusted their assailant and let him in. Police speculated he posed as a serviceman, either maintenance, delivery, or perhaps a salesman. The attacks were a hot topic for the media, and despite the publicity, or perhaps because of the publicity, the attacks continued. Many women moved out of the city, and citizens purchased new locks and deadbolts. Those were some dangerous times, and residents would often avoid trusting strangers or letting them in their house. Strangely, there was also never a report of screaming or struggle from the neighbors. Boston PD diverted maximum osers and resources to the cases. The murderer earned the nickname Mother Killer due to the fact that the victims were mostly mothers. During phase one, the notorious killer would strike by posing as an innocent maintenance worker, salesman, or even a helpful neighbor. Once inside the victim's home, he would quickly turn into a heartless murderer, using something to tie into a death noose around the unsuspecting women's necks, in order to strangle his unsuspecting prey. The killer's twisted technique often left behind a gruesome pattern of marks on the victim's neck, serving as a haunting reminder of the heinous crime. In phase two, the deranged killer targeted younger women. Police didn't realize it until it was almost too late. Things turned grim when a 23-year-old was found strangled in December, only 3 weeks after another young woman's death. Police realized it was the same strangler, and all of Boston was spooked. It was January 1964, and 13 women were dead. Edward Brooke, Massachusetts Attorney General, was heading the investigation himself. After his last murder, that of Mary Sullivan, he left a Happy New Year card propped against her left foot, revealing his light and casual mindset. While attempting to identify the killer, the profilers noticed some similarities and differences in the killings. The killer's methods varied as they were heinous, leaving behind a trail of horror and devastation. The victims, some posed and some not, were subjected to a range of gruesome tactics. Some were the victims of savage and brutal attacks, while others were dispatched with chilling efficiency. The killer was ruthless in his pursuit of power, using both physical and sexual violence to assert his dominance over his victims. Some were raped, some were assaulted with blunt objects, while others were forced to perform unspeakable acts. Beverly Salmon Sue erred the most, as she was killed with over 25 stab wounds, mainly around her right breast. The killer used a range of items to asphyxiate his victims, some with multiple cords, others with just one. One victim met her end with a single vicious grip of the killer's bare hands. As the murders piled up, the city was consumed by fear, wondering who would be next to fall prey to this merciless predator. If we look at the dates, names, and ethnicities of the victims of this ruthless killer, they are chronicled as being very différent, ranging in a variety of profiles. Mrs. Anna E. Sleesers, a 55-year-old seamstress and divorcee, was strangled with a cord from her own housecoat on June 14, 1962. 68-year-old Mrs. Nina G. Nichols, a semi-retired physiotherapist, was killed with a nylon stocking on June 30th within 15 days of the first murder. Miss Helen E. Blake, a registered nurse, was strangled with a nylon stocking and bra on the same day. She was 65. On July 11, 1962, Mrs. Margaret Davis, a 60-year-old widow living alone, was killed by forceful strangulation. She was also the only victim killed without a ligature. Mrs. Ida Irga, another widow, 75 years old, was suffocated with a pillowcase on August 19, 1962. The killer struck again the next day, on August 20th, when he killed Miss Jane Sullivan, a 67-year-old practical nurse with nylon stockings. It is noticeable that all these women were living alone, and well after middle age. You could say Phase 2 began in December of 1962. Miss Sophie Clark, a student, was killed on December 5, 1962, with a nylon stocking and petticoat. She was also the only woman of color among the victims. She lived with her roommate, Gloria Todd Stanton. Boston was gripped by terror as the serial killer roamed the streets. No one was safe, and 20-year-old Sophie Clark and her roommate Gloria Todd Stanton knew it. They made a pact to never be home alone, but fate had other plans. Stanton had to work late one night, and despite trying to reach Clark, she couldn't get through. When she finally made it home, she found Clark's lifeless body in the foyer of their apartment, brutally strangled. The light was on, and Stanton could hardly bear to enter the apartment. But she had to face the horror that awaited her. The nylon used in this case was incredibly light-colored, which showed it didn't belong to Clark, who had a much darker complexion. The stocking was tied so tightly that even surgical scissors weren't successful in cutting through the ties. That same month, he struck again. On December 31, 1962, Miss Patricia Bissett, a secretary living alone, was killed with nylon stockings and a blouse. Patricia was only 24 years old. The strangler took 2 more lives in 1963. His victims were Mrs. Evelyn Corbin, a 50-year-old divorcee, killed with 2 nylon stockings on September 8, 1963, and Miss Joan Gra, a 23-year-old designer living alone, strangled with a nylon stocking on November 24, 1963. Most victims were different in terms of age, marital status, and careers. The final victim was Miss Mary Sullivan, a 20-year-old secretary living with 2 friends, killed with a nylon stocking and 2 scarves on January 4, 1964. Taunting the police, the strangler left a Happy New Year card against Miss Sullivan's foot. In an unconventional method of investigation, Edward Brooke assigned some psychics to the case. That's right. Even though police believed, with good cause, that the murders were carried out by more than one person, much of the public believed it was a single serial killer. The first psychic provided the wrong details, accusing a mental hospital patient. The second psychic, Peter Herkos, who is famous for having assisted in the Mad Bomber arrest, provided shockingly accurate details. These led to the arrest of the man associated most as the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo. On November 8, 1964, Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders. However, many details were inconsistent. With a criminal record of a decade, at age 12 in 1943, Albert was arrested for battery and robbery and sent to reform school. He was paroled the next year and became a delivery boy, but was sent back to the same reform school 2 years later for stealing a car. Much later in his teens, he was accused of molesting a 9-year-old girl. DeSalvo was also arrested twice for robbery, and after being court-martialed, he was in and out of prison. A sex addict, his wife was wary of him, and the two had troubling intimacy when their first daughter was born with an illness. Since sex was at a minimum, seeing as his wife didn't want to conceive again, DeSalvo committed a series of crimes known as the Measuring Man. With a fake name Johnson, he would pose as a talent hunter, get women to strip to take their measurements, fondling and abusing them. He spent 11 months in prison on a simple burglary charge. Following his release from prison, DeSalvo carried out a series of home invasions called the Green Man attacks. He would dress in green work clothes and break into apartments owned by women. At knife point, he would sexually assault them, tie them to their beds in a spread eagle position, and escape. On the 27th of October 1964, a victim who was attacked gave a description of the perpetrator to the police, which led to DeSalvo being identified and reported in newspapers, resulting in more victims coming forward. Earlier that day, DeSalvo had attempted to break into a home by pretending to be a motorist. In November, he was arrested for the assaults and confessed not only to them, but also to being the Boston Strangler. Again, in an unconventional method, he made further confessions, under hypnosis. In his confessions, DeSalvo often got the time of death, ligature, and even assault details wrong. Despite some holes in his stories, he did know details that were not disclosed to general public. Many analysts believe that perhaps the police provided him with the information, in an information bias getting fixed answers. But whatever the case, he was found guilty of the Green Man attacks and sentenced to life in prison in 1967. While in Bridgewater State Mental Hospital, the psychiatrist who evaluated him said he was desperate to be known as the Boston Strangler. DeSalvo was stabbed and killed in his cell in 1973, and his killer was never identified. DNA testing in 2001 proved inconclusive in marking him the killer. However, in 2013, his remains were exhumed, and he was linked to the murder of Mary Sullivan via DNA testing, a match for the semen found on Sullivan's clothes. Many experts speculate that perhaps the murders were the result of two people teaming up. During his imprisonment at Bridgewater, DeSalvo confessed to his cellmate George Nassar about being the Boston Strangler. Nassar, who had twice been convicted of murder and was serving a life sentence for the 1948 killing of Dominic Kermel, was paroled in 1961. Nassar ended up killing Irvin Hilton, an owner of a Texaco station in Andover. For the second killing, he was sentenced to death in 1965, which was later altered to life imprisonment. It's worth noting that Nassar was out of prison when the Boston Strangler murders began. When survivors of the Strangler were called upon to identify the perpetrator, two of them identified Nassar as their attacker instead of DeSalvo. Some have speculated that DeSalvo and Nassar colluded to arrange DeSalvo's confession in order to claim the $10,000 reward money for identifying the Strangler. With DNA evidence linking DeSalvo to the murders, it's important to note that he was a schizophrenic and was diagnosed as simply trying to gain attention. Nassar, on the other hand, had been accurately profiled by survivors. It is still inconclusive who exactly was behind the Boston Strangler murders, although it is largely attributed to be Albert DeSalvo. Whatever the case was, one thing is certain. The Happy New Year card, propped against Mary Sullivan's foot, was the last time the Strangler struck. Whether he was caught or simply lost interest, we will never know. Please enlighten us with your thoughts of who you think is the Boston Strangler in the comments below. If you liked this video, we put out videos every week on Wednesday.